Testing one. Okay. Testing. Mr. Holtzman, I just want to make sure you can hear me.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you. He's not liking the audio. You turn the speaker down.
What'd you turn on? You turned something.
Okay. It could be
There it's on it. Oh,
1, 2. That's better. 1, 2. Yep. We have 2 more minutes.
My watch says, what do you know? Crazy. I think we still have another minute. I think that one's actually recently connected. Here's the one to go by. I see the computer one up in the right-hand corner up there in the lower right-hand corner of the screen.
Oh, yeah.
That's probably the internet time. Unless somebody got really fancy and said, don't be automatic, they actually said it. Which is amazing. So it's 6:59 at the moment. Didn't have an agenda, do we? I just not pick up the gun. Oh, I should have grabbed them. They usually have them sitting in the boards. Those are usually for the public and we get them on the table. He's got it. Thanks, sir. Oh, boy. Full meal deal, huh?
Okay.
Would have been happy with the agenda.
Is now 7 p.m.
Thank you. We'll call the meeting to order and Marcia, would you do a roll call, please?
Director Danziger,
Here.
Director Hassler,
Here.
Director Jex,
Here.
Director Jorgens,
Here.
Director Romer.
Here. Like to report and during our closed session, the action taken, and we'll have the attorney read the statement.
Thank you. reporting out from the closed session that was held with respect to labor relations under 54957.6. Consistent with the concerns expressed by the prior board, the majority of the board has decided not to reopen the current MOU with respect to minimum staffing at this time. The board does not wish to proceed with negotiations at this time because it lacks sufficient information to properly evaluate proposals to change the current staffing model. However, the board remains open to revisiting this issue when MOU negotiations begin in the fall if the union wishes to raise the issue at that time. In the interim, the district will be taking actions to obtain relevant information.
Thank you very much. We'd like to open for public comment on any of the items not on the agenda.
We have two hands raised. We do not have any hands raised. Jacob Arola.
Hey, good evening. So my comment on the closed session is that if the board's changing direction, they should vote on that in public, and there should be comment on that. I think that the action they took in closed session is a violation of the Brown Act itself. So I'd like a lot more information on that. Thank you.
Jonathan Goodwin.
Hi there. I want to echo what the last speaker said. It seems really odd that, you would vote to do it in open session and vote not to do it. I don't get that. I think an explanation is in order. Also, following up on that, said the district was going to, look into the matter to get more information, which I think is perfectly fair. But I think it'd be better if you give a sense of the timeliness of it. And I think personally, that one thing that's really important is to really understand how, not just how the board views this, not just how staff views this, but how all of the stakeholders view this, because this is one of those things where there's no right, no wrong answer. It's a question of trade-offs. Do you want to trade off X for Y or Y for Z or whatever it is? And I just don't see why this is a closed session matter. This really is of public interest. The third thing, sometimes it comes up in a board meeting that there's an item that's listed as a public workshop. And I'm wondering, is there anyone in the world who knows what that is? Does the district actually have a policy that defines what a public work? Is it just different from a regular agenda item? I just am curious on that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, announcements.
We have one more hand raised.
Oh, one more.
Anthony Steph, sorry.
Stevens, Vice President, Local 1230. Thank you. I'd like to echo some of the comments that had already been made about questioning the change of direction in closed session without.
There's an issue with the music accounts in your home. To resolve this, everyone should check that their accounts are up to date in their settings app.
Well then.
Without going back to public comment and having the stakeholders like the previous gentleman said being able to weigh in on the matter. The change of direction has a direct impact on public safety. The direction was to restore the staffing of a dedicated ambulance in downtown Orinda that has been cut since 2013. The same ambulance that federal SAFER grants were written and accepted for to restore. So to go ahead and change direction without any further studies even being at hand and continue to put the public at risk, I think is inappropriate. I do think it's a public matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Still more.
Vince Wells.
Yeah, this is Vince Wells. president of firefighters, local 1230, represent the Moraga-Orinda Fire District. I just wanted to chime in and kind of back up my vice president, Anthony Stevens, that there's been a lot of conversation and a lot of work, a lot of back and forth over the restaffing and bringing the staffing back up to that ambulance since it was shut down in 2013. And our efforts have been nothing but to restore services back to those days once the economy, improved, which we have seen that has happened. If you look at other surrounding jurisdictions that closed stations, they now have improved, their financial situations have changed, and they're reopening stations that were closed. And this is what we're asking in Moraga-Orinda. And so for this, we're hoping that this item remains on the agenda for discussion. Our confer process has kind of been halted to maybe this is a conversation we should have during contract negotiation. And that was not the direction that we feel we received at the based on the direction of the previous board's decision to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Vince.
This is John. I just want to comment, obviously not on the substance of this matter, but the issue was raised by at least one speaker that this is not an appropriate subject for closed session. I would just want to say that the original instruction was to explore this issue in negotiation. It is a negotiation item. The Brown Act provides a clear exception for closed sessions, for labor issues. So the closed session was entirely appropriate.
Okay,
We do not have any more hands raised, and we've not received written public comment.
thank you. All right, on to announcements, item 7.
President Jex, with your approval, I would recommend skipping ahead out of order to agenda item 9.1. We have a guest presenter here acknowledging their time and allowing them to move on to other matters. If we could move to 9.1, the Tunnel East Bay Hills Fuel Break environmental presentation by Sequoia Ecological Consulting. We recommend that in the interest of everyone's time.
Right. Welcome.
I'm pulling up your slide.
The recording started. Again, my name is Deb Montana. I'm president of Sequoia Ecological Consulting.
Wait.
One moment. I just want to make sure that your microphone
A little bit low. It's just a little. Is this better?
Oh, yeah.
Better?
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank
Sorry.
you so much.
I'm going to introduce myself a third time. Deb Montana, president of Sequoia Ecological Consulting. We are a local, small, women-owned business in Contra Costa County. And we were hired by Moraga-Orinda Fire Department to help them with their CEQA compliance and environmental compliance for the Tunnel East Bay Hills shaded fuel break. So again, thank you for having me. And Chief, I'd like to let you jump in here whenever you're ready. The purpose of my presentation today is to present the project details for the Tunnel East Bay Hills Fuel Break project to you and to bring everyone up to speed on what's been done to date and what the next steps are to get this fuel break to implementation. I've been working very closely with the Fire Marshal, Jeff Isaacs, and some of our project managers, and also our teaming partner, Horizon Water and Environment, Ken Schwartz and Robin Hunter. The goals of the fire break are to really reduce mostly ladder fuels within the Moraga Lafayette Hills. And we're going to go into more detail on that next slide. This is a diagram of the project, and this is fuel modeling that's occurred. It's actually available to you on the CAL FIRE website. You can see in the red slashed area is the actual fuel break overlaid with the level of fire risk. And so you see the majority of the fuel break, you can see, is in the very high fire hazard severity zone, and then also overlaps some high to moderate zones as well. Next slide. The goal of, the fire district in general is to reduce wildfire fuels, improve evacuation systems, reduce the fire risk to homes, increase access for firefighters, evacuation that enables them to fight fires, allows them to provide more containment during active fires, but also to educate the public and provide grants to residents. Next slide. So this fuel break is part of a larger regional effort. This diagram shows one project that was undertaken back in 2019. It was the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break. It was a highly successful project undertaken by the fire district, and it was one of the 35 emergency listed projects by the governor at the time. And that was back in 2019. And CEQA, the requirement for a CEQA analysis to be done, was actually waived because this was considered such a high risk and high priority project. We were able to get that project done, I think, in just under 4 months. Sequoia also assisted with environmental compliance on that project as well. While CEQA was waived, we did want to make sure that this highly environmentally sensitive area, the Moraga Hills area, was protected during this important fuel break work. So we had biologists conduct pre-construction or pre-treatment surveys for wildlife species, botanical species, sensitive cultural resource sites. And the green depicts the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break. And you'll see now that the brown shaded areas are the tunnel East Bay Hills Shaded Fuel Break. And you'll see how they kind of complete the perimeter of the overall fuel break, the overall objective of the regional effort. This shaded fuel break will reduce and manage wildfire hazard risk, intensity, and the rate of spread. It will reduce impacts to communities and infrastructure. It will maintain and actually enhance biological diversity. And it will promote conditions that favor the native species, especially on the botanical side. It will also enhance native fire resilient plant communities and provide strategic locations to effectively fight wildfires. Next slide. So while the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, CEQA was waived. We didn't have to go through the full CEQA analysis. However, on this project, we do. Those 35 emergency listed projects, this is not one of them, and that time has run out. So in order to ensure compliance with CEQA, we were hired by the Moraga-Orinda Fire District to ensure that we had all the environmental aspects of the project cleared for implementation. In order to do that, in order to go through the CEQA process, we are able to use the California Department of Forestry programmatic EIR. It's an environmental impact report that analyzes various aspects of the environmental baseline data. So it analyzes the potential impacts of this project on biological resources, cultural resources, air, noise, visual, water quality, and so on. The CAL-VTP stands for the California Vegetation Treatment Program. It was developed again by CAL FIRE, and it covers all fuel reduction projects throughout the state within what's called the treatable landscape or the state responsibility areas. The majority of this project, Tunnel East Bay Hills, falls within that treatable landscape. There is a portion of the project that falls outside of it, and that's called local responsibility area. Fortunately, the way the EIR was written, we are able to do an addendum to our analysis to incorporate those local responsibility areas as well in our CEQA analysis. So Sequoia has been conducting biological surveys, cultural surveys, and the other surveys that I mentioned earlier for air, noise, water, visual. We've been working closely with our teaming partner, Horizon Water and Environment. Over the past year and a half, we've done a lot of field work, a lot of desktop review, and a lot of writing. The biggest portion of this CEQA analysis is a written document called the Project Specific Analysis. And that's a document that is prepared to justify, our coverage or our ability to fall under the Cal VTP. So it's a written document that basically displays all of the baseline data out on the site within the project, and then analyzes the impacts dependent on the treatment types that we're going to use. So for example, what's covered under what's allowed as a treatment under the Cal VTP includes prescribed burning, manual vegetation treatment, mechanical vegetation treatment, prescribed herbivory or grazing, and targeted ground application of herbicides. All of those treatments will be used and applied during this East Bay Tunnel Hills project. No treatments outside of that list will be used. So that's one justification of why we can use the Cal VTP. I think we can go ahead.
Could you clarify on the herbicide use?
Oh, sure. So actually, we just had another meeting about this. The herbicide use is going to be very minimal. It's going to be hand applied. It's not going to be spread using backpack sprayers or wide application. It is going to be very focused on each plant species, applied by hand and only as necessary to prevent regrowth or resprouting of removed shrubs or understory. So it's a very focused application and not used very often. Next slide. So the PSA, or the project specific analysis, as I said, it analyzes the treatments within the defined treatable landscape. It analyzes the various treatments or project activities that are allowed under the EIR. It determines whether or not they're within the scope of the Cal VTP and whether it's within the treatable landscape. It also has mitigation measures or project specific measures that we have to follow during treatment to make sure that we minimize or avoid impacts to sensitive resources. Next slide. So here's an overlay of the Cal VTP treatable landscape. And then you can see our project and where it fits within the treatable landscape, as well as where it falls within the local responsibility area as well. So we first of all conducted a desktop analysis to really identify where we would expect to see sensitive resources, both biological and cultural. And as I said earlier, we also conducted extensive field surveys to field verify that desktop analysis. There are approximately 6 work areas, 1,223 acres are planned to be treated. And already we've conducted some of our work under East Bay Mud on East Bay Mud property, but they already have been analyzed under CEQA under their programmatic EIR for maintenance on their lands. So while those acres fall under this project, they've all already been treated under East Bay Mud's EIR.
So you don't have to do it again?
We don't have to do an analysis on that portion of the project. It's already been done. Correct.
So long as we follow the East Bay Mud, the prescriptions and the limitations on take that are in place, we basically, on their land, under their plan, work can proceed on our project.
Correct.
If you adhere to what their
100%.
report said.
Yes.
Correct. And we've been working closely with East Bay Mud. They've been a great teaming partner. We've had several meetings with them, and we work closely with their biologists. And Sequoia is actually one of their on-call consultants for biological work on their lands in general, outside of vegetation management. So we have a great relationship. I've included some before and after photos of similar shaded field breaks that have occurred. This one was on the Pinehurst shaded field break, and you can see the difference that it makes. A shaded field break is basically removing the ladder fuels from the ground up to 6 or 8 feet. That vegetation that grows in that zone is considered or called ladder fuels, and they allow the fire to spread from the ground up into the canopy of trees where it can spread much faster and be more devastating. So reducing or removing those ladder fuels is a very effective fuel treatment. Next slide. Again, another example. It doesn't even look like the same area. And this is, I believe, a project in Marin. And I believe, is this Inspiration Point? This was on the North Orinda shaded field break, I believe. Yeah, very effective. You can see all the ladder fuels removed. And then the trees are only limbed up, meaning all the limbs either 6 to 8 feet high are removed from the bottoms of the trees, but no live tree removal will occur as part of a shaded field break. unless the tree is diseased, dead, or dying, and it's considered a hazardous tree removal. There are a plethora of project-specific requirements, SPR-specific project requirements. I just highlighted a few of them. Some of the most important that we'll be adhering to involve the California red-legged frog, resources like the woodrat nests, nesting bird surveys, Alameda whipsnake. There are mitigation measures and SPRs for a number of sensitive biological resources out on site. One of the most important aspects of the work that Sequoia will be doing to support this project is providing environmental training and education to the crews that will be doing the work. Every morning, our biologists will show up, will educate the crews on what they might see out there, what to avoid, where our biologists have placed flagging to create an avoidance buffer around a sensitive resource, and what to do if they see that. And then we show them pictures of some of the sensitive resources, whether it's cultural or biological, what they might see on site and what to do if they see it. And then our biologists are actively working alongside the crews during treatment to make sure that those resources are identified and avoided. As far as plants go, we actually just had a very successful meeting with other stakeholders, such as the California Native Plant Society, Sierra Club, Audubon Society, and some other local interested parties. And a lot of the questions were about, well, how are you going to protect sensitive or listed plant species? We have several very qualified botanists on staff who have been conducting focused and protocol level rare plant surveys over the past season. Focused rare plant surveys involve 3 different visits during the various blooming periods for the listed plants. They're very thorough, they're very focused, and they're timed appropriately so that they are conducted when the plants are blooming and you can actually tell what the species is that you're looking at. So we've been very diligent about our surveys, making sure they're timed, making sure they're conducted by qualified resource consultants, and collecting all the data by GPS and flagging in the field if necessary for avoidance.
Excuse me, on this slide, so you have those 2 plant species up there?
Yes.
Are those both protected
Yes,
species?
they are. Yes, they are. And we've actually identified them on site. We've GPSed them and we have the locations. We know where they're at. So even when they're not blooming, we know where they're at and we know what to avoid. Next slide. Some additional key protection measures. Wetlands are going to be one very important resource that we will be totally avoiding impact. We are creating buffers alongside riparian areas or areas along creeks and other waterways, and completely avoiding those that are very high species richness in riparian corridors, and we do not want to impact those. We are also avoiding wetlands to avoid the need for consultation or permits from regulatory agencies. If we were to impact a waterway, we would need to go to the Water Quality Control Board. We'd need to engage with, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and those permits can take time to acquire and usually involve other mitigation. The wonderful thing about fuel reduction work is that we can avoid natural resource and still get this really important work done and completed and successfully. So, okay. I pretty much discussed the purpose of a shaded field break and what it looks like. This is just an example of a sensitive resource on the left-hand side. You'll see the red arrow is pointing to a woodrat nest. It looks like a bunch of sticks on the ground, but to a trained biologist, we can see them a mile away practically. And the San Francisco dusky-footed woodrat is a sensitive species. And I don't know if you can see the flagging there, but there is flagging around that perimeter. We give them 1 meter or 2 protection, and the crews just simply work around it, and they can see it. They've identified it. We've trained them on it, and we're with the crews. So that woodrat nest is protected. And on the right-hand side, in the very far right of the picture, is a sequoia biologist wearing all of our safety gear, and she's monitoring all the crews that are weed whacking. And I think this is the area behind the high school, but I'm not totally sure. This was on the North Orinda shaded field break. And I believe while the crews were working in this area or similar area, they found an active turkey nest, so turkey eggs, and they were able to because they're using hand tools, they're not using a masticator. Using the hand tools enables the crews to slow down and really identify resources before impacts occur. In this tall grass, that's really important. And then my teaming partner, Horizon Water and Environment, should be on the Zoom to present the next couple of slides. Hi, Robin.
Hi there. Horizon's archaeologists and cultural resources team have implemented some of these key protection measures around cultural resources. We've done background research, reached out to local tribes, and done field surveys. And there were a few cultural resources that were identified during the desktop review background research, although when our archaeologists went out, they were no longer present, so they won't be impacted by this project. And impacts to cultural resources could potentially occur where ground disturbance occurs, if in any instance where heavy machinery is being used. So that's why we had our archaeologists go out and to comply with the Cal VTP requirements around cultural resources. Next slide. Other resource concerns that we've evaluated, impacts to visual or aesthetic resources. Some of the requirements are to feather the edge of adjacent vegetation, so it's not an abrupt change into the treatment area, avoid staging in areas that it can be viewed by the public, as well as providing vegetative screening of staging areas so that, again, they're not visible to the public. Landslide, erosion, water quality protective measures. Some of these include limiting the use of equipment on steep slopes and stopping the use of heavy equipment during precipitation, limiting the disturbed soil areas and then disturbing and stabilizing any disturbed areas, implementing water quality protection best management practices, as well as erosion and sediment control measures, and using for any areas that are over 50% slopes, using a registered professional forester or licensed geologist to evaluate those slopes before treatment to avoid any erosion issues. Next slide, please. For noise, the treatments could have some effects on adjacent sensitive receptors. Some of the measures implemented to reduce these effects are limiting the equipment to daytime hours, as well as complying with the relevant noise ordinances of the local jurisdictions. Notifying the sensitive receptors of the work prior to it occurring, placing the staging areas away from sensitive receptors, and properly maintaining equipment so that it minimizes the noise. Similarly, for recreation, there could be impacts to trails from the treatment activities, and the measures to reduce the impacts is to notify recreationalists of these temporary closures. And I think this, I believe it's back to you, Deb.
Okie doke. Thank you. So where we are now, the PSA has been drafted. All sections of the PSA are complete. We've also completed drafting the additional reports that need to accompany the PSA and its addendum, including a biological resource report, botanical resource report, and a cultural resource report. So you can see it's it's a lot of heavy lifting in the beginning, but it enables a year's worth of really important work. We are going to submit that PSA to CAL FIRE for approval, and we anticipate it taking approximately 30 days for approval based on previous PSAs. And we're hoping to get the work started as early as May 2023. Correct me if I'm wrong. Again, we plan to use mechanical, manual, and prescribed burning treatments. We plan to work weekdays 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. during daylight hours. However, it was pointed out that with prescribed burning, sometimes we are confined and may have to do work over the weekend for some prescribed burn due to the air pollution requirements. Let's see, daylight hours, and then grazing is 24/7 whenever implemented. It's hard to know at this point what the treatment maintenance will be required, what those intervals will look like. For tree dominated areas, we're assuming every 3 to 5 years for limbing up. Scrub dominated areas, maybe every 1 to 5 years, and then grass dominated areas, we're assuming an annual treatment for maintenance might be necessary. But we're also being mindful of, the availability of our resources. Are the fire crews available, or are the vegetation crews available? Are there crews off fighting fires? What time of the year should we do treatment, maintenance? So there's a lot of things to consider when we're scheduling the work itself as well as the maintenance work. For comparable timeline, the North Orinda Shaded Field Break, as I said earlier, it was 1,500 acres and it took about 4 months to complete. That was considered an emergency project and it needed to be done in a very specific short amount of time. And we had upwards of 15 biologists out there working with 4 or 5 different crews in different areas simultaneously. So we were working very diligently to get that project completed. I believe it was the first one completed under that emergency order by the governor. So we take pride in that. It was a very successful project. The Tunnel East Bay Hills project is not under such a tight timeline. It's about 1,200 acres and it's spread out over the next 1.5 to 2 years. Again, because of resource availability, we want to make sure we're giving ourselves a buffer and that we're able to do the work thoroughly in one spot before we move to the next, keeping in mind that crews aren't always available in the fall. That is the best time, as a biologist, that is the best time to do the work when the nesting bird season is over and we don't have to send so many biologists out there to do nesting bird surveys. But again, that's when the wildfire season typically starts. And so we're really trying to figure out the puzzle of timing. And some of the, like I mentioned earlier, East Bay Mud was a great teaming partner, Wildlife Heritage Foundation, and there's some PG&E ownership on this property too, as well as CAL FIRE. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
I have a couple of questions. Do we know if there's any private land in the project?
There is private land.
So how does that work about getting permission? You have to get permission to go on private land?
Absolutely. And
We need an access agreement. The same thing on the North Orinda Shaded Field Break, where particularly along Bear Ridge, we transited through some private parcels. We use an access agreement that is looks exactly like a CAL FIRE agreement, but with an MOFD logo on the top. And because it's a state project and we're utilizing CAL FIRE ground resources, we have to do a CAL FIRE access agreement as well. That is revocable by the resident. As I believe I reported out to the board during the North Orinda Shaded Field Break, we had one instance of a resident revoking the access agreement in real time as crews were committed to that parcel and carrying out the work, where there was inside the family unit information had not been exchanged.
Okay.
And we lost a half day of work as a result. The other thing, just to put a point to what Deb was saying before, with the North Orinda Shaded Field Break, not only did we have a waiver of CalCEQA, but we had an imperative to move quickly because of the governor's prioritization of those projects. Moving at that speed incurred additional costs per acre because we didn't go through what's turning out to be a year or more process of the environmental planning. Therefore, we had to augment the number of folks who were in the field to do an equivalent of it in real time. We also had multiple crews working from out of the area, which increased costs. So this project is moving more slowly, much more deliberately, but we believe our cost per acre will end up being lower since we won't be having to pay for emergency measures.
if I could just add to that really quickly about the costs. We had this question during our stakeholder meeting recently, and they asked if there was a lesson learned on the North Orinda that we would apply to this project. And I had to honestly say the lesson learned was that we were much more conservative on the North Orinda Shaded Field Break regarding environmental resources than we needed to be because it didn't go through CEQA. And so we were very deliberate and very, again, just very mindful and conservative about the perception of going through such an important project without a CEQA analysis. We knew, that perception was really important. And so the chief was he really wanted to make sure that we did everything right and well. And it turned out, again, to be very successful. And the stakeholders, CNPS, Sierra Club, they're very happy with the measures that we took to protect nesting birds, botanical and cultural resources.
The quote at the time was, while the governor can waive CEQA, the governor cannot waive litigation. So we wanted to protect the project from litigation by essentially going to the extreme measure with regard to environmental mitigations at every step of the way so that we would preload the project against the threat of litigation.
I have one more question then. Sure. I seem to remember this from the North Orinda Shaded Field Break. When you do a final report, you just go through where that final report goes, has to go to the state?
It goes to
approve it?
CAL FIRE. Mhm.
CAL FIRE?
Yes, CAL FIRE.
That's it?
That's it.
That's the one.
So it's part of an EIR, and that EIR has already gone out for public comment and has been approved. So it doesn't go out to public comment.
It doesn't,
Mm-mm.
okay. And the final report, is that a confidential report?
No, it will be posted on CAL FIRE's Cal VTP website. So you can view our project specific analysis, the PSA, on the website. The additional reports, the focus biological, botanical, and cultural resources report, those are kept confidential because sometimes they identify the location of sensitive resources. But the PSA for the Cal VTP will be posted, and you can go on there now. There's upwards of 20 additional or other PSAs that you can review to get an idea of what it will look like.
And you would go to CAL FIRE and what do you look at? What do you just look for?
You mean, how do you find the reports?
Yeah, how do you find it?
Sure, you Google Cal VTP PSA, and it should probably take you right to that Cal VTP page. And then it has a list of hyperlinks of PSAs for other projects.
Oh, okay.
One of the first ones done was for Bear Creek Redwoods for Mid-Peninsula. I believe it was for Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space. If you just Google Bear Creek Redwoods PSA, they'll probably all pop up there too. And I'd be happy to send you the link to make it a little bit easier.
I can find it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Any other comments by any of the board or questions?
It's great. Thank you. Very informative.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Deb.
Okay,
So we have one hand raised. Jonathan Goodwin.
Yes, thank you for that presentation. I have questions along two lines of concern. One is the fire district's flamethrower. Are you involved in the protocols for the use of that flamethrower? If so, what are they, and how diligently are they enforced? The other is, you had mentioned maintenance, which I was glad to hear about, but it was awfully iffy. You'd said that, for instance, fuel ladders are a good way to keep fires from spreading. And that's certainly true until they regrow a couple of years later. So it sounds like you're saying, the grasses will regrow in 1 to 2 years and the trees will need limbing up in, I forgot what you said, 4 to 5, somewhere in there. But, there's not going to be any money to do that work. Who's going to go out there and trim those trees? I mean, the grant's going to be gone. It's a concern to me because it's, you do all this flashy work and a lot of money gets spread around, by the way, in the 7 figures. And, 5 years later, you're back where you started. That's kind of disappointing. And, I'm sure that, nobody wants to see that happen, but what are you going to do about it? It's the question. So I'm wondering, how much is regrown now? Has there been any maintenance on the North-Orinda fuel break? How has that worked out? And will you actually create a serious maintenance plan given the need for wiggling as you described? It's there are factors that have to be adjusted for, but if there's no maintenance plan, I'll bet you $5 there's going to be no maintenance. So I'm just wondering how that's going to work. Thank you.
So to answer the question, the use of the Terra Torch is governed by our internal policies, and those are adhered to. And then with regard to maintenance, the North-Orinda Shaded Fuel Break is being maintained through the use of prescribed fire and prescribed grazing. There's significant portions of the East Bay Hills Tunnel Fuel Break that'll be maintained through prescribed grazing and the reintroduction of periodic prescribed fire. That said, specifically on the land zoned by East Bay Mud, and there's an analog to land zoned by East Bay Park that are outside of the fuel break project, the onus for the maintenance of lands rests with the landowner, not with the fire district. And this speaks to the broader issue of whether or not the fire district can regulate the condition under which these lands are kept. That said, we see this initial entry that the fuel break with the one-time state money that must be spent within the prescribed period and does not allow for out-year maintenance beyond the 3-year cycle of the grant. We see this initial entry as setting conditions not only for the periodic reintroduction of prescribed fire to restore the varied fuel mosaic that was prevalent in these lands before the exclusion of fire approximately 200 years ago, But also it sets conditions for the reintroduction of prescribed grazing and the brush covered lands. Once the brush has been initially cut, cattle are very proficient at either eating or trampling down the new growth in a way they are not with mature brush. So I agree with your concern that it would be helpful if we had a multi-year state-funded plan that included maintenance. However, those grants are not in the offing. And we believe the initial entry that this one-time money is enabling will set conditions for a decreased probability of uncontrolled wildfire in the East Bay Tonal Hills area.
Okay.
So this is Director Jorgens. So do we, if you are going to maintain something that's already had these wonderful extensive studies done, do we have to redo the studies to maintain them?
I defer to Deb, but generally speaking, when the maintenance is done through other means, like prescribed cattle as an example, that it's grazing, there is no review required for that. If we're putting hand crews back in, it depends on the size of the project and on the land. The land that's owned by East Bay Mud, as mentioned earlier, there's nothing project specific about the prescription being used in that area. So maintenance of that land in out years falls under the existing East Bay Mud habitat conservation plan. On the private lands, it's a very different scenario. One, that it's primarily a grass component, which would be maintained through grazing. And that private landowner falls under very different rules, particularly when they're using private money for the maintenance of those work areas in out years. Because a private landowner has much more latitude with regard to how they maintain their land than public lands or the use of public funds. But I defer to Deb for how long the Cal VTP will.
So the PSA analysis does cover any treatments that would occur. And I believe the length of time is pretty extensive, 5+ years, but if Horizon's still on, they can confirm that
They're not.
okay. But it would cover treatments for several years in the future, whether it's covered by this specific grant or future grants. The CEQA analysis does not have to be redone for some time, but I can get you the specific number of years if you'd like, but it's pretty extensive.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your attendance and the report. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, move on to announcements.
Good evening, directors. We'll begin with the finance report.
Do we want to go through all the announcements?
Sure.
So we'll go ahead and start with 7.1. Brief information only reports related to meetings attended by a director at a direct district expense.
Hearing none.
None.
Questions and informational comments from board members and staff? None. Communications received?
We have a single item received of note. It was included in the board packet. And we'll begin with the finance report. Thank you, Mary.
Good evening, directors. I just have a brief finance report. Our strike team reimbursement to date for this year, the estimated receivable to date is $1,030,000. Payments received are $987,000. And so our net outstanding receivable is $42,000. This is no change from last month. The remaining outstanding receivable is for the flood preposition assignment that occurred in January, and we haven't received payment for that yet.
That's great. It's worth noting that we have several additional members deployed for this latest flood, so those numbers will change next month.
Yeah. Other items, the fiscal year 2022 audit. Audit was scheduled for the week of February 13th, with final audit report expected in March of 2023. The audit has been delayed due to auditor staffing issues, and the audit is now scheduled for March with a final audit report expected in April of 2023. We received 6 proposals in response to the RFP for the new audit firm for fiscal year 24. The audit committee is reviewing the proposals, and the audit committee will make a recommendation to the board at the April 2023 board meeting for board approval of the new auditor. And that concludes my report.
Great.
Any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I'll be providing the HR report. One of our firefighter paramedic trainees was injured during the fire academy and missed more than the requisite amount of time for which they could return. So they've been dropped from the academy, and we've placed them back on our eligibility list for a future academy opening. We continue to have one firefighter paramedic trainee in the fire academy. The state grant funded fuel mitigation specialist positions, the two that were authorized, one has been filled. And we're moving forward with interviews. They were actually conducted yesterday with filling the second one. We also filled the existing vacancy we had due to a resignation. So we now have 4 fuel mitigation specialists on board in time for this year, and moving rapidly forward to fill the 5th position, and anticipate have them fully trained and ready as we move into our fuel mitigation fire prevention efforts. We posted a promotional examination for the position of fire captain paramedic. It was released on March 1st. The final filing deadline is May 30th. The examination will take place on June 8th. And this recruitment will establish an eligibility list for future openings. And then we've retained a new communication support volunteer, Blake Rothfuss, who is assisting the district with upcoming residential bridge surveys. Blake is an engineer and has previously worked with the fire district as a contract engineer, and currently works for the city and county of San Francisco as the chief engineer for the Hetch Hetchy Water and Power Division. He's a resident and engages on a periodic basis in this role to confirm that all the residential bridges are in fact capable of supporting the weights they are listed for, so that we can safely move our fire apparatus over them. As you drive by the residential bridges, particularly visible along Moraga Way, you'll note there are colored dots placed on the driveway. That indicates to our crews what the weight load is and what size apparatus can travel over them. And he has been helping us out in this role as a communication support volunteer to ensure that those are in fact still able to carry the load they were engineered for.
And they do that on all the private land also?
Yes, sir. We ask permission, visualize them, and provide. He says he gets an awful lot of interest from residents. Never really thought about that. How's it look? So it ends up being a good public service at the same time. Residents have generally been very receptive to the service, especially given that it will facilitate rapidly getting firefighters or an ambulance to their front door.
Chief, just
Sure.
one question. Any update on the plans examiner?
Pending the item that was discussed in closed session, that position continues to be held open. Will be followed with fire prevention.
Good evening, directors. For the month of February, we had a total of 7 complaints, 2 for dead trees, 5 exterior hazard abatement complaints. With the wind and storm this week, we had additional dead tree complaints. Our ordinances that were passed last month by the board went into effect this week. So our property transfer numbers were before our ordinances took effect, had a total of 55. 10 would have passed, 45 would have failed. We took that as an opportunity to educate the property owners what the new requirements are going to be, and that the deadline to comply with those requirements would be June 1st. We were able to close 76 cases from 2022. We still have 90 open cases we're working to close. We did get 3 days of chipping in with the new staff members. We put them through chipper training. Our vendor that we purchased the chipper for, that was one of the reasons we went with them. We have as long as we own that chipper, they will come do training for us. So we have their mechanics and their staff come up and put our folks through initial training for the new employees and refresher training for the employees that were here previously. And we do that a couple times a year just to make sure they're up to date on all that training. Have not started any of our state mandated occupancy inspections. And with the new staff members really focused on training, with the new ordinances taking effect, we're also working to get everything input into our software system so that once we start inspections and abatement season, we will be ready to go. I'm happy to answer any questions that the board may have.
So at the moment, since we don't have a fire code that's in effect, how are we doing new housing real estate transfer?
We're not.
approvals?
So,
But you said we're going and talking to them. We're just not
Right.
actually having anything to enforce. Is that the?
yes, sir. We're sharing information about best practices, but we are not in a position to require anything since those weren't in effect. With the adoption of the defensible space ordinance, we now have the mechanism back in place to require the 2 foot by 1 foot box and other fuel mitigation measures that exceed state minimums.
We didn't want to stop the processor and say, oh, we don't want your phone calls. We
no,
wanted to
for sure.
continue that. We have a great relationship with our realtors. So when they would call, we would still go out there and use that as an educational opportunity.
That's great.
With the exception of the nuance of what language is being used, I think the scenario was transparent with regard to process. That said, we were very careful not to require anything, but folks have become comfortable with this is what you do when you're selling a house, and it's become part of the selling point, I believe, that's being advertised, that you're getting a house that has these measures in place.
So just so I'm clear about where the fire code and the ordinances are now, we sort of separated
Yes, sir.
fire code being building kinds of things and
Yes.
ordinances being outside the building kinds
So
of things.
2302 and 2303, the defensible space ordinance and the fuel break ordinance are in effect. The fire code has been ratified by the city, and we're waiting for the town and the county, at which point the fire code will go into effect.
Great. And no, it's not literally in the agenda because it wasn't here either. So when do we expect that to happen?
Very soon. The city adopted it 2 weeks ago. The town, I believe, is adopting it this week, and the county's on standby. As soon as the town does, the county quickly does it on consent.
Great.
Okay. Next, we have an operations report.
Thank you, Fire Marshal Isaacs.
All right, next slide, please. These are some of my favorite pictures. So the weather patterns we recently experienced continue to be one of our largest concerns as they affect conditions across the district, the region, and the state. And these pictures were taken in the early morning of February 24th near Tilden Park in the fire district. And we've continued to see large amounts of rain, sleet, and hail, and even snow at the higher elevations throughout the district. That has had significant impacts on our roadways and infrastructure, to include a significant number of trees down yesterday that created significant regional power outages. Next slide. The environmental conditions have affected the roadway. We have continued to see some pretty dramatic vehicles off the road, as you see in the top left and bottom left, as well as accidents on Highway 24. We'd encourage everybody to watch their speed, particularly on Highway 24. It does not take very much rain for scenes like this to be played out. We've had some extended extrications, some of which would involve fatalities for the occupants, all of which were attributed to excessive speed or excessive speed while changing lanes. Next slide, please. On February 21st at approximately 1546, crews responded to a structure fire in St. Mary's Garden neighborhood.
Offensive attack, 2 out of 7.
Upon arrival, crews discovered a garage fire that was spreading to the main residence. Crews were able to make an aggressive interior fire attack to contain the fire to the area of origin in the corner of the garage. They were able to save the main body of the structure before the fire spread. This fire remains under investigation with the cause undetermined. Next slide, please.
Oily rags.
On February 23rd at approximately 12:15, crews responded to a structure fire in the 400 block of Tharp Drive in Moraga. First engine was on scene in under 6 minutes and 6 minutes and 48 seconds from time of dispatch. Upon arrival, crews encountered a fire in the front room, the structure quickly spreading to the attic and adjacent rooms. Crews engaged in offensive interior fire attack and were able to rapidly contain the fire to the area of origin. Crews were able to contain the fire in under 17 minutes with no injuries reported, and the home was returned to the homeowners, remains under investigation. And next slide, I believe we have a video. The indicative, the fire, obviously the room origin is on the right side. The fire gained access to the attic. The eaves there, pushing out indicative of an attic fire. The crew on the roof preparing to carry out vertical ventilation in conjunction with the interior attack. You'll note at the door, one of my favorite elements to point out, we see an integration of Confire and MOFD. Confire wearing the tan color turnouts, MOFD in black. We have continued to have seamless integration with our surrounding agencies with AutoAid and Boundary Drop.
Did these people have a monitored fire alarm, or did somebody have to call in?
I don't know. I believe they were home in the opposite end of the house. Typically with houses are so compartmentalized, particularly if the doors are closed, that a fire can get pretty well established in the opposite end. And if there's not an audible alarm to warn of the fire starting, they can get well established before folks are aware. I don't know the status of the automatic alarm, the automatic detection systems themselves.
And I take it we don't have the ability to force people to do that retroactively, right?
We do not. We, as a standard measure, the engines all carry smoke detectors and 9-volt batteries, and make a habit of checking whether the smoke detectors work and as a PSA replacing them. But we only have the ability with structures, things that are not meeting the modern standard or considered an existing non-conforming, and we don't have the ability to retroactively require things like that.
Because all the new ones are required to be wired together.
Interconnected, and we have a NFPA 13D residential sprinkler system requirement as well. And sprinkler buildings do not burn. The average sprinkler building fire is put out by 2 heads popping, because the fire, as soon as it breaks 125 degrees, the head releases. Water is put on the source of the fire, and water puts fires out. It's essentially like having a firefighter hanging from your ceiling in every room in the house. For the next slide, we currently have members deployed to Monterey and San Benito counties associated with the flood conditions from the levee break that caused evacuations across the Santa Cruz region. There are 2 captains assigned as safety officers providing incident support to the USAR team and the incident management teams in collaboration or through the California Mutual Aid System. We had another member deploy today, backfilling for the Urban Search and Rescue Team, Task Force 4. And we have several members that are upstaffed on regional pre-positioning resources funded through California Office of Emergency Service as far as our ongoing effort to staff up in advance of emergencies. This area, we had significant, with the significant rainfall, we had a lot of trees down and some interruptions to the roadway, but nothing like this we're seeing in other counties. So we were able to provide resources to those areas to support their needs. Next slide, please.
Just as a quick question while you're doing this. So I happened to drive by a tree that was across the road the other day, and I'm pretty sure I was one of the first ones to see it because it wasn't there 10 minutes before I wanted to go the other way. Who are you supposed to call?
So 911 for a tree down actively on the roadway, and then it gets routed to PD, and fire will go out for the immediate traffic control, life safety, and then county roads or city public works, depending on the jurisdiction, will respond to actually remove the tree. We have more rain coming. We are now yesterday was the 11th atmospheric river of the year, and there's more rain forecast into next week, as you can see there. And we just asked people to continue to be aware of the rainfall, to drive with great caution, and if they need sandbags, a phenomenal time to come for sandbags is before it starts to rain heavily, and everyone else is coming for sandbags as well. As mentioned in the last board report, during the storms in January, we were going through approximately 10 tons of sand every 45 minutes at several of our stations. Or I'm sorry, a delivery, which is 2 tons, 4,000 pounds every 45 minutes at a number of our stations. And we're doing that across the 3 stations that have filling sites, extrapolating out to an awful lot of sand per hour going out the door. So we'd encourage folks who know they have a need for sandbags this would be a great time to stop by for your sandbags. And lastly, we have a good news story. Truck 44 was out and about, and they came across some young entrepreneurs running a lemonade stand. And as you can see, the firefighters are smiling an awful lot bigger than the kids are. Firefighters enjoy lemonade. It's a great opportunity to patronize a local business.
Excellent. That's cute.
It concludes the operations report. Oh, I'm sorry. And the last one, this is one of our apparatus. This is what a fire engine takes to tow a fire engine that is broken, went out of service, out of district, and had to be flatbedded back out for repairs. Speaks to some of the challenges of running the portions of our fleet that are aging. This is a picture that made me cry, and every firefighter I sent it to sent me back pictures of crying emojis. So when things go wrong on a fire engine, it can be awfully challenging to fix because of their size and the specialization of the equipment. Thank you, Marcia.
It goes right down to that flat trailer.
So it's a tilt on. So you see the back of the trailer has about a 45-degree rake coming off the rear wheels. So they lift up the front to lower it to make a ramp, and then they slide the ramp slides back as a mechanical actuation that allows it to lay flat on the ground. And they have the world's largest winch that is able to winch the engine on and then strap it down for transport to the shop for repair.
They can't use an 18-wheeler tow truck? Those things are almost as big as your fire truck. They're big.
Yeah, you can come, but it's not ideal to drive very far with that thing with the road wheels on the ground behind, just because the stability and the flatbed is a better option when you have the time to call for it.
Wow.
So we're using a spare now?
We're using one of the reserve apparatus, sir.
So when something like this happens, you gotta get all the equipment off of that one and put it on the other one. and-
When an apparatus goes away on a flatbed, you assume you're not going to see it for a while. And so the equipment and the people are transferred obviously onto a reserve. The age of our reserve fleet is showing. And so in times when we have one reserve type one, and if that is down, then we shift over to the type threes and use the type 3 in frontline service, which is not ideal. Smaller pump size is and not as many hose options, smaller hose complement and fewer ladders. So it's not ideal. Obviously, we run type ones because type ones are appropriate for this environment. But when a rig goes down, if our reserve apparatus is either not available or already committed, the crews shift to the type 3.
Is this the one that was damaged on the road?
No, sir. This one has electrical gremlins that came to the fore. Believe we've already addressed the Tunnel East Bay fuel break and operations, and happy to answer any questions. Concludes the fire chief report.
Any other questions? Okay, on to the consent agenda.
And so we have some public comment.
Oh,
Jonathan Goodwin.
Yes, Chief Winokur, you used the term, I wonder if you mind expounding upon a little bit, regional repositioning. Is there something that was created to actually, in the event of, needing to call up more personnel and place them around? Is that actually a thing?
It's regional pre-positioning, not repositioning. And prepo has been used for at least 5 years now. We benefited from regional pre-position units during the Merrill Circle fire. And Cal OES has been very aggressive with utilizing additional local government resources to pre-position in advance of weather conditions that create the potential either for significant fire or in this case for significant weather-related impacts.
And so Cal OES then does their calculations and requests some different agencies to call up more personnel, or how does that work?
It's the other way around. At the regional level, we as a region submit our worksheet suggesting that we believe we have local conditions that would warrant prepo and that we have the units available that we could fill it if they approved it. Cal OES approves it, and then the units are upstaffed with off-duty personnel and reserve apparatus, and then become available for both in-county and out-of-county response.
And Cal OES does the admin of this. Is that correct?
Correct. Just a similar situation we use for out-of-county mutual aid for wildfires. In this case, they're being pre-positioned, staged within the county that's staffing.
Yeah, well, I had no idea this existed. I'm very glad to hear about that. Thank you.
thank you, Jonathan.
Jacob Arola.
Good evening once again. After this operational update, I'm very concerned about the operational knowledge of some of the directors. So as we do for any citizen, my station is open. I'm at 45 B shift. I'm happy to educate or talk through or answer any questions directors have about operations and how things function and work and the type of calls we run. And just to add to the chief's comments, after hours on weekends or late at night, we are the ones that will be responsible for limbing and bucking up that tree. And many of us in district are educators on the chainsaw as well. So happy to discuss the type of calls and anything we do operationally, especially with some of the recent decisions that are being made regarding operations. Thank you.
Thanks for your comment. Okay, consent agenda. Any directors want to pull any item for further discussion from 8.1 to 8.8? If not, we'll
Let's take public comment.
consider public comment.
We do not have any hands raised or received written public comment.
And we'll take a.
I'll make a motion to approve consent agenda items 8.1.88.
I'll second that, Craig George.
Okay.
Director Danziger.
Aye.
Director Hassler.
Aye.
Director Jorgens.
Aye.
Director Romer.
Aye.
Director Jex.
Aye. Okay. Regular agenda 9.2.
We already did that. There we go. Okay.
Oh, this is the,
LRFS.
Public workshop.
9.2 is covered. All right.
That is impossible to read.
9.3.
I brought my own larger version.
9.2, we did 9.1.
Okay.
My one was the Sequoia thing.
Okay, 9.2.
Yeah.
Long-range financial forecast.
Good evening, directors. The long-range financial forecast has been updated. The forecast covers a forward-looking 10-year period. The forecast is separate from the annual operating budget. Board direction tonight will be used to prepare the annual operating budget, which will be presented to the board in a public budget workshop on April 19th. The long-range forecast is scheduled for adoption at the next regular board meeting. Preparation of the fiscal year 2024 budget is in process. All of the budget pieces you see on the slide have been completed and are reflected in the long-range forecast. With the exception of operating expenditures are not done, those are still in process. The long-range forecast uses an assumption of plus 4% over projected current year operating expenditures. The significant assumptions used in the forecast are listed on this slide. Property tax revenue for fiscal year 2024 has been projected by HDL, which is a third-party property tax forecasting consultant that the district contracts with. After 2024, the forecast uses an assumption of 2% and 3.5% as directed by the board last year. Ambulance revenue is projected to increase 3% in the next year, then 1.5% throughout the forecast. Net strike team revenue is projected at $300,000 with a 3% increase throughout. The Tunnel East Bay Hills Fuel Break administration fee is forecast to be $684,000 and is forecast to go into the general fund. This is subject to board direction. Salaries and overtime expenditures are forecast to increase 5% on July 1, 2023 per the terms of the MOUs, then 3% thereafter. Benefits are forecast to increase 3%. Cesara pension rates are forecast based on the projections provided by Cesara for the first 5 years, then based on GovInvest projections. I'll talk about this in more detail on the next slide, but Cesara projections are based on the December 2021 actuarial valuation. Market conditions have changed significantly since then. OPEB contributions in the forecast are included at the full actuarially recommended contribution. Finally, pension trust contributions are included using the board-directed discount rate of 6.25%, Cesara actual investment return of minus 10.6% in 2022, and the salary increases in the MOUs. This slide reviews pension costs in more detail. The Cesara board decreased the discount rate used by Cesara from 7% to 6.75%. This resulted in an increase to the district's pension rates beginning July 1, 2023. The district's rates increased 10% primarily due to the decrease in the discount rate. The increased costs are reflected in the long-range forecast. Cesara's actual investment returns for 2022 were minus 10.6%. These negative investment returns will affect the district's rates beginning July 1, 2024. Cesara provides 5-year projections.
But those are not reflected in these plans yet, right?
Well, it's not reflected in the district's rates yet, but let me get to the end of the thing in this, that we'll slide that graph to the right. We'll explain it. Cesara provides 5-year projections of the district pension rates, which are used in the long-range forecast. Cesara's updated 5-year projections that reflect the minus 10.6% is in process, and we're expected to receive them within the next 2 months. So based on the December 31, 2021 actuarial valuation, Cesara's actuary projected the Moraga-Orinda Fire Safety Cost Group will reach full funding as of December 31, 2026. However, in the same letter, the actuary noted that this projection was based on the market value at December of 2021, and market conditions have changed significantly since then. And so the graph that I added to the slide, the graph shows total planned funding in the forecast designated for pension costs. So the blue part of the graph reflects mandatory costs to be paid to Cesara. The red part of the graph shows the planned contribution to the district's pension trust fund. The trust contributions are board directed. The total funding, all right, so that whole circle designated for pension costs reflects the 2022 investment return of minus 10.6. So when Cesara provides updated 5-year projections to the district that reflect the negative investment return, what's going to happen is that the blue part of that pie right there is going to get larger, and the red part is going to get smaller, because the total funding designated for pension costs of 8.9 million should still cover the whole thing. The 8.9 million reflects the minus 10.6% that Cesara actually earned. Please.
So, but I think you, someplace in the notes here, it said that the assumption for this year, for example, was back to the 6.25% in GovInvest.
Yes, GovInvest is at 6.25, correct.
Yeah, I don't think that's where the market thinks things are going to go this year. So, you know, I would say that's optimistic at this point. So, you know, I think things were, and I guess I have another question about Cesara. I know they're always incredibly, you know, the data they use is at least a year stale on a regular basis, and sometimes more than that, depending on how, you know, whether it's their public investments versus their private equity investments and things like that. So when they say they're updating it, they aren't updating it for real numbers that are happening at the end of 2022. They're actually updating it for numbers that are still a year old, right? A lot of the numbers are still a year old, because I don't think they certainly don't have their K1s from all the private equity investments they have. They won't have those till October. So they can't be, for a significant portion of their portfolio, they can't have anything yet. So how old is the data that we're going to be basing the new numbers we're getting in 2 months on?
I don't know. I bet we can find out.
Because we kind of need to know that, because, you know, we can look at the market and have a pretty good idea what's happening to those things, but, you know, they always give us, you know, really old numbers, which are good and actuals and things, but it's, you know, they have big stars on with footnotes that say, oh, by the way, this is really, you know, a year old data we're using. So
Right, we can look at that.
Are you?
So there is one, I have what, 2 more slides, I think. Should I keep
Okay.
going?
All right.
Great. All right, thanks. All right, so in July 2021, the board adopted a fund balance policy. The policy states the district will maintain a minimum unrestricted fund balance of 17% in the general fund at fiscal year end, with a goal of achieving a 50% year-end fund balance in the long term. The forecast projects the district will meet the 50% long-term goal in fiscal year 2030. The graph illustrates the district's cash flow. The cash balances at the end of the fiscal year are at the peak and the highest cash balances. The last time the district used the teeter plan was in November 2019 due to receivables from the North Orinda shaded fuel break project and for strike team revenue at that time.
For the new directors, just a context, as mentioned before, we moved very fast on the North Orinda shaded fuel break. That caused the district to have to carry the note for the preponderance of the work, and that was particularly active fire year. So we had a number of strike team receivables, and not very busy fire years have a compounding effect that 1, we have a large amount of money, and 2, the state has a large volume of request for reimbursement they have to work through, so it takes them longer. So right as we have the greatest outstanding in the state is when the state takes the longest to process.
remind us to put a note on this 17% number. I think we need to maybe have another iteration with the board to see how we feel about that number these days.
This slide reviews the outstanding debt. So the outstanding balance for the Station 43 debt is $2,350,000 at an interest rate of 2.14%. And finally, the last slide is capital project, and board direction is requested for the capital projects, because then these amounts will end up in the next year's budget, which is coming next month. So for fiscal year 2024, so the plans are to include the Station 41 Administration Rebuild Project in the amount of $4.8 million. The purchase of one Type 1 fire engine for $1.1 million. Appropriations for the purchase of the self-contained breathing apparatus at a cost of $621,000, which is partially funded by a grant. Replacement of the fire station alerting system at a cost of $500,000 and new portable radios at $250,000. The forecast then in the next year includes funding for the final year of Station 41 rebuild of $4.8 million. The next major capital project that is planned is for the remodel of Fire Station 45 in Orinda. And the forecast projects funding all the capital projects using transfers from the general fund and existing funds in the capital projects fund. So staff requests board direction on the forecast and on the capital projects. And this concludes the presentation.
So,
Craig?
so at one point we had, I think, $1 million in, sort of, we had $1 million and then 2 other big years for Station 41. And we didn't spend $1 million, obviously.
We have not.
So, but that was in this year's budget, we had that. So we got to be way ahead of the budget in that. So have we, are we really going to, do we think we're really going to spend the 4.8 next year? Or do we really think it's going to be shifted right, 6 months or whatever?
At the current time, it's very likely it'll be shifted, given that we, as addressed in closed session, that process continues. It is a reasonable assumption this will be adjusted. We don't know how far and how fast it will be adjusted based on the ongoing real property negotiations.
But it's missing $1 million no matter what, right?
I know for
Oh,
fiscal year, for this fiscal year, I project that we would spend $1 million.
Oh.
Because it's budgeted, and that's how it's forecast. Basically, whatever was budgeted is forecast to have been spent. So that's already out of the numbers.
Okay, and that shows up in here too, that we assume we're going to spend it even though we're not.
It's evolving. We until very recently, I thought we were going to spend it, and the negotiations have bogged down. So then any money that's that we believed we were going to spend that we do not at the end of the year rolls over to the unrestricted reserve. Essentially improves our position.
Right. But I mean, it'd be really hard to spend it to actually have the cash go out right now. I mean, it's kind of no matter what's going to happen.
Extraordinarily unlikely that'll happen. At this
So
point.
we probably should update the numbers then. If that's a, I'm not saying all the numbers, but that one in particular seems to me is a pretty big number out of our, 3% of our budget. It seems to me we ought to, you can make it 5.8 if you want or something, but we shouldn't just assume it's going to roll into the general fund and be that much extra to me.
Yes, sir. That was my direction, that until we knew what the change was going to be, to leave it. And so we only touched it once. And right now we don't know, although it's becoming increasingly likely that it will be no dollars based on the absence of it. That said, I believed we were going to be well underway by now. And we have folks lined up for the RFP, ready to go, ready to start rapidly turning and expending funds to move this project forward. But obviously that assumed that we were going to be moving faster on the real property negotiations.
Okay. Otherwise, the things to me anyway, my comment would be, if we're going to ask for comments, that these numbers all seem like they're in the right ballpark. I read through the more details in the back and they look.
Any other comments, questions?
Yeah, this is Director Danziger. I had a question regarding the grants. The grant program for the fuels mitigation and home hardening grant programs. So the forecast shows $100,000 each year. And I know that we approved a $500,000 total grant program. Why does it show $100,000 each year? I'm not sure.
I can answer that. All right. So that's based on the current program and the actual demand, right, for what the board has approved for the board approved program. So we have only spent about $50,000 in this year, and we don't expect we already have a whole bunch of mesh waiting to hand out.